so excited to hear from Kazu Haga, and we should all welcome him.
I usually, you know, as a trainer and as a facilitator, I could facilitate for days, but I'm not used to speaking for so long, so I haven't had to use note cards in some time. So when I was initially asked to come up here, after we had agreed that I'd be able to come, I was exchanging emails with Ellen, and in one of the emails she said that, okay, so you'll have 90 minutes for your presentation. And I was looking at that email like, really? Like 90 minutes? You want me to speak for 90 minutes? And so maybe I'll do like 80 minutes of Q&A or show a 60-minute movie or something. But so I'm just really hoping that you all don't get sick of me, because 90 minutes is a long time, especially in the mornings, because I suck at mornings. I'm really not a morning person. So if you see your neighbor nodding off to sleep, maybe you can give him a little nudge before I see it. That'd be very helpful. So like Kaylee said, I'm a trainer in a philosophy called Kingian Nonviolence, which was based on the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but being a trainer in a philosophy that has such a long and rich history, the word legacy has become something that is really important to me and something that I really honor. The organization that I work with, the Positive Peace Warrior Network, we really only started doing work January or February of last year. And since then, we've had incredible growth and incredible success. But I also know that that's only because we stand on the shoulders of so many greats that have come before us. Gilberto Shonin and I were actually just talking 2 days ago about the fact that we stand on so many people's shoulders. And so I know that even though as an organization we've only been around for just over a year and a half, that our success has been decades and decades in the making. I received the training from another man by the name of Jonathan Lewis, who is the founder of the Positive Peace Warrior Network. He received his training from Dr. Bernard Lafayette. Dr. Bernard Lafayette received his training from Reverend James Lawson, as well as the work that he did with Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King got his influences from Gandhi. And so it wouldn't be right for me or for anyone from the Positive Peace Warrior Network to really claim our own success, because our success is only made possible by all of the people that came before us. And so it's such an incredible honor and a privilege for me to speak for an organization like FOR, which is an organization that has such a rich history, such a long legacy of struggle. It's an organization that I've personally learned a lot from myself. So it's really an incredible honor for me to be here. I've recently been thinking a lot about one of the greats within FOR's history, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin, who I'm sure many people know. Let's give it up for Bayard Rustin. I just recently screened a movie about his life at our office in Oakland called Brother Outsider. I thought it was a really timely piece. I'm sure I don't have to explain who Bayard Rustin is to anybody here, but he was an openly gay black man organizing against the war and against segregation from the 1940s. So the courage it must have taken just for him to be himself, never mind organizing and being so open about his stances around the war. And you know, I was thinking about what he would have thought of the recent Supreme Court rulings, with, you know, being able to celebrate the Defense of Marriage Act and Prop 8, and at the same time what happened with the Voting Rights Act. And it's like, you know, part of him has a little bit more freedom and part of him has a little bit less. And I really wonder what he would have thought about those rulings. Dr. King, when he started speaking out against the war, said that, you know, because Dr. King, he got a lot of criticism for speaking out against the war, against the Vietnam War. And he said that, you know, I fought too hard and too long against segregation to segregate my own conscience. And so, you know, with these issues where on the one hand we're celebrating the fact that we can honor and recognize the right to love, and at the same time we're losing a lot of rights that people bled for and that people died for, really made me think about Bayard Rustin and his life and the courage that he showed. One of my favorite stories about Dr. King is early in the Montgomery bus boycott movement. his house was firebombed right after he had his first daughter, Yolanda. Dr. King wasn't in the house, but his wife, Coretta, and their brand new baby, Yolanda, was in the house. And after that bombing, Dr. King went out and bought a gun. And he had armed guards. And it was Bayard Rustin, who at the time was working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, that went down to Montgomery and convinced Dr. King that if you're going to be the leader of a nonviolent movement, that you can't be walking around with the gun, that you can't have armed guards. And so Bayard Rustin was a huge influence in the movement. But I also appreciate that story because it reminds us that even for somebody like Dr. King, nonviolence was a pilgrimage. It was a struggle. He wasn't born nonviolent. In a piece of writing that he wrote called The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, one of the first things he says is that when he was young, he came perilously close to hating all white people. And so even for Dr. King, nonviolence was a struggle. It's not an easy thing to arrive at. And so I just wanted to share a few stories about my own pilgrimage to nonviolence, and specifically to Kingian nonviolence. When I was trying to figure out how I would fill 90 minutes of airtime, I was remembering my first public speech. My first time I got in front of a group to say anything was when I was in 6th grade. And I'm not sure how it happened because I wasn't the most popular kid in class or anything, but I ended up getting nominated from my homeroom to run for school president. And for some reason, what just happened never really clicked with me. And I don't know if I didn't believe it or if I didn't take it seriously, but the teacher told me that, at the end of the month or whatever it was, that all of the kids that were nominated from their homerooms would have to make a speech. And, I can't blame it on the language barrier because I'd been in the country for about 4 or 5 years at that point. There were some challenges that I was going through home, so I wasn't taking school as seriously. But whatever the reason, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe that I would have to make a speech. And finally the day came, and the whole 6th grade class is gathered in the library, and all these kids, one kid after another, is going up and, making these passionate speeches, like, if you vote for me, I'll get rid of bullying, and if you vote for me, we'll have the best class field trip ever. And then my name was called. And I still didn't believe that I would have to go up and make a speech. And I was a shy kid back then, so the only thing I could muster up was I went up there and I said, "Hi, my name is Kazu, vote for me and vote for a change." And then I sat down. And there was just this silence in the room, is that it? And somehow out of that I managed to get 6 votes. And I don't know what my friends must have been thinking, wasting their votes like that on me, but I always remember that as my first public speech. And about a year later, I was involved in my first direct action, my first protest. It was 8th grade, and for whatever reason, we decided that year that foreign language class was the class that we were all going to goof off at. And throughout the year, we actually went through 3 teachers because we were so bad to the teachers that they all ended up leaving. As I said, I wasn't a very good student then, and nonviolence was a pilgrimage, and I wasn't quite there yet. And we were, halfway through the year, we were at our 3rd teacher already. And one time, I brought a tape recorder to class. I don't think I need to explain to anyone in this room what a tape recorder is. 'Cause I work a lot with young people. They're like, "What's a Walkman?" I brought a tape recorder to class, and I don't even remember how it started, but at some point I started interviewing other students in the class about how much they didn't like that teacher. And this was in the middle of class. I was walking around interviewing people. And at some point, the entire class just started singing a song. In the middle of class, right? This teacher had completely lost control of her classroom. And in retrospect, I feel awful about it, but at the time, it was great fun. And, of course, as soon as the class got out, word spread like wildfire about this tape that I had made. And all the kids were coming up to me like, "Oh, Kazu, you got to make a recording of this tape for me." And the next period, I was in history class. Phone rings. Teacher goes to pick it up. He looks at me. He's like, "Yep, he's right here. All right, I'll send him down." And I don't know if anyone has ever been called down to the principal's office, but it's not a fun feeling. And so my heart just sank. And I ended up getting suspended for a day and had to write an apology letter to the teacher. And after that, a couple of students started saying, you know what, this is enough. We got to get rid of this teacher too. And so we decided to have a sit-in. We decided to sit in front of our lockers and not leave. And being in 8th grade, having never done anything like that, that's as far as we had thought it through. We had no idea what we were doing. And so I remember that morning, there was just a lot of excitement and buzz in the air, like, oh, we're gonna do a sit-in. And I remember walking out of the classroom just with, my heart was pounding. And for a while, I wasn't sure if it was gonna happen because none of the kids were sitting, right? But eventually, one kid sat, 2 kids took a seat, and soon the whole hallway was just filled with kids taking a seat. And we didn't know what to do next because we hadn't thought about it. And eventually, the principal came down and he took us all to the auditorium and we talked about it, and a week later, they let the teacher go. Success, right? That was one of the, an important lesson that I learned much, much later in life. It's one of the dangers of direct action, right? Is that it can be so exciting and exhilarating. And even when you don't have a good strategy, it can be fun. And that's one of the dangers of protests, because I found that a lot of movements, a lot of people in my generation, it's almost as if the protest becomes the goal in and of itself. It's like if we can organize a successful protest, then change will automatically happen. But, right, like if we yell loud enough, maybe revolution will come. But I learned later that direct action and protesting is something that you use to get to a larger goal. Right? It's something that you use to give yourself power so you can go back to the negotiating table, figure out a win-win solution, and ultimately end in reconciliation. Direct action is not a goal. Right? The goal of direct action is to end in reconciliation. And the way we ran that direct action, there was no opportunity for reconciliation with the principal, with the teacher that got fired, and with the other teachers who were upset at what we did. That was not our goal. It wasn't even in our consciousness about reconciliation. But that would be something that I wouldn't learn until much, much later. Around that time in my life, I was starting to face some serious conflicts in my family life. There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of anger, a lot of chaos in my family life. And like a lot of young people, I didn't have the skills to manage those conflicts in my life. In Kingian Nonviolence, we say that conflict itself is a completely neutral thing. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's how we respond to those conflicts that gives it a good or bad outcome. So things like yelling, arguing, fighting, violence, war, those things aren't conflicts as much as they're things that happen when you mismanage a conflict. But at the time, I didn't have the skills to manage the conflict that I was seeing every single day in my life. So at a young age, I turned to drugs and alcohol, like a lot of young people do. I remember, it's funny because now one of my favorite quotes that I really live by is a quote by Tagore, an Indian poet and philosopher. He said that, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and found that life was service. I served and found that service was joy. And I really try to live by that because I found joy and passion through serving my community. But I also remember the first opportunity that I had to do any service was when I was in freshman year of high school, where we had community service day. We'd all go into high school, check in the morning, and then we broke up into different teams, and some kids went to the fire department to wash fire trucks. Some kids went to a senior home to spend time with our elders. Some people went and swept streets, whatever it was. And me and my friends decided to ditch school and steal some beer and get drunk in the park. And that was my first opportunity to serve. But I ended up dropping out of high school about 15 years old, and for a couple years I was just in the streets my only concern in life was getting high every single day. How am I gonna get high? How am I gonna get high? When am I gonna get high? How am I gonna get drunk? Whatever it was. And then when I was 17, in May, or I guess it was late April of 1998, I heard about a group called Nipponzan Myohoji. And we have 2 monks from the order, Kanaeda Shonin and Gilberto Shonin, from that order with us today. And I'd never really heard about these folks or how crazy they were. But they were crazy enough that they were planning a walk from Massachusetts to New Orleans and then down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route and to begin the process of healing and reconciling from the legacy of slavery. And I had never done anything like that before. And I had never been involved in any sort of activism, any sort of peace work, but for me, just where I was at in my life, I was looking for something new. I was bored. I was looking for something different. And so I told myself I would go on it for a week. And I was 17 years old, so I had no idea just the grand scope of the vision of what they were trying to accomplish. But for me, it was just an opportunity to get out and do something different. And I always say it could have been the walk, it could have been a military recruiter, it could have been any number of things. I was just looking for some way out of just the rut that I was in. And so I decided to go on it for a week, and I essentially didn't come home for a year and a half. These monks and nuns just took me under their wings, and I was off. I remember it was the third day of the walk that I decided that this was where I was meant to be right now, at that point in my life. And I almost remember I was walking, and I'm sure a lot of you I know have been on their walks, but we drum and chant as we walk, right? And I almost remember in my head like walking across some railroad tracks on the third day of the walk, and as soon as I walked across the railroad track, it was at that moment I was like, this is where I'm meant to be. And I have a feeling that's not how it actually happened. It's how I remember it, because that makes for a better story. But it did happen on the third day that it was just a consciousness I can't leave. So after that first week, I went home and repacked my bags and joined the walk and was off for a year and a half. That walk is something that it taught me so much, and obviously it's something that I would never take back. And at the same time, it was a walk that was also filled with a lot of conflict. And by the time we got to, when we were walking down in the Deep South, we would have arguments and meetings where all 60, 50 of us, however many there were at the time, would just yell and cry and argue with each other for hours and hours on end, because we were uncovering the legacy of slavery. That's a pretty deep legacy. And with the diversity of the group that we were walking with, just all of the challenges and the problems of society started manifesting in our own group, and we didn't have ways to cope with it, and we didn't have ways to deal with it. And so by the time we got to New Orleans, everyone that I had become close to on the walk had decided that they were leaving. So I also decided that I couldn't go on Africa with that walk if everyone that I was close to were leaving. And so I was really struggling with what I was going to do next. It was about 6 months after I left home. And I knew that I couldn't go to Africa. And I also knew that I couldn't go home, because I knew that I wasn't ready to go home. I knew that if I went home, I would just start hanging out with the same people and getting right back into the rhythm of what I was doing. I just knew that I wasn't ready to do that yet. And this part of the story I actually do remember very clearly. This is exactly how it happened. We were staying at a church down south somewhere, and I was, I smoked cigarettes back then. Thank God that I quit. I quit about 7 months ago. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very happy about that. But at the time I was smoking, and I was sitting outside this church, and I was really stressed out because I didn't know what to do. And so I was chain smoking. I think I almost chain smoked an entire pack of cigarettes, just trying to figure out what to do. And I eventually put the cigarettes down and went back inside the church, and I was sitting on a chair, just trying to figure out what to do. And at one point I asked myself in my head, I was like, God, just show me what to do. Tell me what to do. And right as I said that, Jun-san, who I think many of you probably know here, Jun-san came up to me and she said, Kazu-san, I'm going to Lumbini, Nepal, the site of the Buddha's birth, to help with the construction of the world's biggest peace pagoda, and you should come with me. And so instantly I was like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. That's where I'm going. And so the next day I bought a one-way ticket to Nepal. I had no idea what Nepal was, or where it was, or what language they spoke, or anything. I just knew that that's where I needed to be. So I went to Nepal and ended up spending a year overseas, living in the temples of Nipponzan in Nepal and India, Sri Lanka, Cambodia. I did a walk in Cambodia. And the temple where I stayed the longest was Lumbini, helping with the construction of the pagoda. And the schedule at that temple was we would start prayer, morning prayer would start at 5 in the morning. So prayer from 5 to 7, breakfast from 7 to 8, construction work from 8 to 5, prayer from 5 to 7, dinner from 7 to 8, and then we'd have a couple hours to take a shower, wash our clothes, and then go to bed, and then start it all over the next day. And I was like that 7 days a week. Breakfast was the same thing every day. Lunch and dinner were the same thing, so we literally had 2 different meals, 7 days a week. And I look at it now, and I don't know if I could live that lifestyle now, but at that point in my life, it's exactly what I needed. You know, within 6 months, I went from staying up all night getting high partying to this temple life, and it was exactly what I needed. It taught me discipline, you know, it taught me the importance of hard work, and it taught me the importance of a concept in Japanese called shugyo, which is a word that there's not a great translation for in English. Shugyo is kind of a combination between practice and training, but it's like a spiritual practice. There's a deeply spiritual component to me. You know, when people talk about they have a meditation practice or a martial arts practice, they're talking about shugyo. And it's something that you train yourself to get to a larger goal in life. And the construction work there involved me picking up a plate of wet concrete, putting it on a cushion in my head, walking up 3 flights of stairs, dumping the concrete, going back down, getting another plate, and we do this all day. And it was, I mean, it's crazy to think about it, but it was one of the best times of my life because I was there practicing shugyo. I just recently returned from Japan. Had the honor of being invited to go out there and do some work by an organization called Byakko Shinkokai. They're the ones that started the Peace Bowls. If anyone's seen Peace Bowls, that's their thing. And another practice that they have are these mandalas that they draw. They write mantras like "May peace prevail on earth," write that over and over and over again in small, tiny writing until it fills this beautiful image. And one of the men that I was in Japan with wrote some reflections about his trip later on. And he said that, you know, when you write something like that over and over and over again, and you're meditating on that over and over and over again, what does that do to the mentality of the person that's doing that over and over and over again? And the idea of shugyo, oftentimes you end up doing something over and over and over and over again. At Nipponzan, they chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo over and over and over again. Martial artists, they practice certain moves over and over and over again. And so that idea of training, that deep training of shugyo became really important to me with my time at Nipponzan. And it's also something that is really important within the philosophy of Kingian Nonviolence. Kingian Nonviolence is something that grew largely out of the Nashville student lunch counter sit-ins, where Dr. Bernard Lafayette was one of the student leaders there. Diane Nash, John Lewis, many leaders of the civil rights movement grew out of the Nashville movement. And sometimes people ask, how come so many important leaders grew out of that one small movement in Nashville? And it's largely because of their commitment to training. Reverend Jim Lawson was leading nonviolence trainings in Nashville for those leaders, and they trained for an entire year before they engaged in their first protest. And that's what made them so successful, and that's what allowed them to become leaders in other movements throughout the civil rights movement after that. And so within Kingian Nonviolence, the idea of training, that social change is not going to come easily. And if we're really going to create peace, then we need to be committed to the idea of training to the same level that soldiers are committed to training their troops. Right? If people are training their soldiers for 6-month boot camps to go to war, then we need to at least be committed to the same level of creating peace. That nonviolence is not easy, and we need to be trained in social change. It's just not going to come easily. So Kingian Nonviolence, you know, we're going to be doing a 90-minute workshop later on today. Our introductory workshop is usually 2 full days, and it's 16 hours with homework. And our organization, we don't even call those trainings anymore. It's an introduction into a philosophy in which you can be trained in, and if you would like, that training starts at the end of those 2 days. The level 1 certification to become a trainer in this is a 2-week training of like 14-hour days. And even then, people don't feel comfortable. A lot of people don't feel comfortable at the end providing this training because it's deep stuff. Right? I used to think nonviolence was easy, that it was just about turning the other cheek. And I realized that it's so much more than that. after I got back from Asia, I was overseas for a year. After I got back, I started working with an organization called the Peace Development Fund. It's a progressive social justice foundation. I ended up there for just over 10 years. And it was a really unique foundation in that even as a philanthropic organization, even as a foundation, we were exploring models of philanthropy in which the relationships that we build with our grantees were not based on the money that we give away. So as a financial institution, our main work was to give grants. So how can we build relationships that weren't based on the grants that we give away? Because we believe that and if we're trying to create social change, then relationships just can't be based on money alone. And so one of the initiatives that I coordinated at the time was called BASE. It's Building Action for Sustainable Environments. And Pete, who I bumped into for the first time in about 6 years, yeah, he's all the way back there. I met him through BASE. He was directing an organization called the Shundahai Network at the time. And BASE was a national coalition of 16 communities that lived around some chain of the nuclear cycle. So we had organizations that lived near uranium mines, research facilities, storage facilities, production sites, all the way down to the waste facilities, so that we could see the impact of the nuclear cycle in each link of that chain, and bringing all those communities together so that they can see how their local struggles is tied to a much larger issue. And one of the challenges with BASE was that we brought together rural black communities from Mississippi with native communities from the reservations in the Southwest, with farm worker communities in the Northwest. So there were a lot of cross-cultural dialogues, and we needed to learn how to work together between cultures. And peace is a messy process, right? It can get really messy, and so BASE got really messy at times. And we would also, similar to the Middle Passage Walk, spend hours arguing with each other. And I remember one time we were at a meeting in Little Rock, Arkansas, and there was a reverend named Reverend Jenkins from Aiken, South Carolina. And she stood up and said, I realized after all these arguments that we've had over the years that in my community, in South Carolina, in the church community, if I spent more than a couple minutes to introduce myself during group introduction activities, that would be considered disrespectful because I'd be taking too much time. But I now know that in some native cultures, if you don't spend a half an hour to introduce yourself, that's considered disrespectful because you're not sharing enough about each other. And she said that I realized that a lot of conflicts that we have between cultures is just a simple misunderstanding or a lack of acknowledgement about each other's value systems. That if we just sat down and got to know each other's cultures a little bit better, that a lot of what we assume as conflicts and cultural clashes that has a tendency to escalate and end up in arguments, they don't have to be that. And so I actually want to pause right now, and I want to encourage you to turn to one of your neighbors, perhaps somebody that you don't know, and I just want to offer 5, 6, 7 minutes for you to talk about a time when perhaps you can remember you've had a clash with somebody based on different cultural understandings, different cultural values. It doesn't have to be in a movement context, although anyone who has been through Occupy maybe has some experiences with that. But I also, I was in a long-term relationship once with a woman from Mexico. And we used to always have these clashes, and she used to always say, when we weren't arguing, we would laugh about it, that, I was this stereotypical, stoic, unemotional Japanese male, and she was this stereotypical, fiery, emotional Latina, and we would always have these clashes, and it was a challenge at times. So I want you to turn and just for a few minutes, just have a conversation about a time that you may have experienced some clashes based on different cultural values, and if you got through it, how you were able to get through it. So just a few minutes. Thank you all for engaging with each other. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from conflict. All right? Conflict is like we say, it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing. It's something that we can learn a great deal from. And in the Peace Development Fund, I experienced a ton of conflict, and I learned a ton from it. And there's a conflict in the fact that some people want to take 2 minutes to introduce themselves, and others want to take 20 minutes. But oftentimes, the argument begins when we start making assumptions about each other's cultural values and what's the right way to do something. When again, when we really sit down and talk to people, perhaps there's not that much of a conflict, but something new that we can learn about each other's cultures and each other's ways of being. So the 10 years that I spent in PDF, filled with conflict, but it's, again, another experience that I would never trade in, because I learned to be with so many different types of people. And in late 2008, early 2009, there were two incidents that happened that, again, changed my life forever. There's been several things that have happened throughout my life that completely changed my life. The first happened in November of 2008, when I took my first two-day workshop in Kingian Nonviolence. Kingian Nonviolence is a philosophy that I like to think of it as it was given birth on the morning of April 4th, 1968. And early that morning, Dr. King was in his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was having a conversation with Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was at the time the national coordinator of the Poor People's Campaign. And they were talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and Dr. Lafayette had to go to Washington, D.C. to attend to a press conference. So as he was leaving his hotel room, Dr. King called out to him and said, "You know, Bernard, the next movement that we need to have is to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence." Dr. Lafayette said he kind of didn't know what King meant by that, but he figured that they would just finish that conversation later on. He had to catch a plane, so he said, "All right, King, Dr. King, we'll talk about this more later," and he took off. And unfortunately, they were never able to finish that conversation because just about 5 hours after that conversation, Dr. King was shot. So Dr. Lafayette then took that as Dr. King's final marching orders to figure out a way to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence education. And over the years, he worked with another guy by the name of David Jensen to create this philosophy, this training curriculum called Kingian Nonviolence, as a way to institutionalize and internationalize the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King and the organizing strategies used in the civil rights movement. Now, this philosophy has gone around the world at this point, to Nigeria, to Colombia, to Israel, all over the United States, working in schools, working in prisons, working in community institutions, working with law enforcement, as a way to embed the practices and the philosophies of nonviolence as part of the day-to-day practices and operations of different institutions. The second thing that happened was about 3 months after that workshop. When I took that first two-day workshop, I told Globe, who was the trainer at the time, the founder of PPWN, I told him that this philosophy is stuff that I always knew, that I just didn't know how to articulate. And so this philosophy was just so alive in my head when on New Year's morning of 2009, a young man by the name of Oscar Grant was shot and killed by the transit police in Oakland, California. Many of you probably have heard his name before. There's actually a movie called Fruitvale Station about the last 24 hours of his life that's about to be released. But Oscar Grant was a young man, African-American man, 22 years old, father of a 2-year-old girl named Tatiana, who was out partying on New Year's Eve with some of his friends in San Francisco. About 2 o'clock in the morning, New Year's morning, he was taking the train, the BART, back to his home of Hayward, coming through Oakland. And on the train, he got into an altercation with another group of young men, him and his friends. And so the BART police, the transit police were called, and the train was stopped at the next station, which was Fruitvale Station, about a mile from where I live. And at one moment, the police had, taken Oscar and all his friends out onto the platform, and they were questioning him. And there was a moment where Oscar was being held down, laid down on the ground, his stomach on the ground, with one police officer holding him down using his knees, while another police officer stood up, unholstered his gun, and shot him in the back. And this happened right on the train platform on New Year's Eve, on New Year's morning. So there were hundreds of witnesses, and many of them caught the whole incident on their cell phones. And the videos got uploaded to YouTube, and the whole thing just went viral. And I ended up on the steering committee of, we called it the Coalition Against Police Executions, which was the community coalition that was behind organizing a lot of the rallies and the community's response to it. And throughout that movement, I realized that even in movements for peace and even in movements for justice, there's many different ways in which we can engage in that work. And the Oscar Grant movement, I mean, at that time, it had so much potential. Like you can ask anyone who lived in Oakland during the first few months of 2009, and just the raw emotion that was present in the entire city, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. You could go on BART, go to the laundromat, go to a cafe, everyone's talking about Oscar Grant. We could have called meetings with the mayor, with the chief of police, with the BART president, and they would have had to meet with us. So it was a movement, it was a moment in history that had incredible potential. But in my opinion, we let it go to waste. And in my opinion, in my perspective, it was because even though that movement had so much potential, it was a movement that was largely grounded in anger and grounded in hatred towards the police. We hated Johannes Messerly, who was the police officer that shot Oscar Grant. We hated the police. And on the one hand, we have every right to be angry, right? I mean, we need to be angry about these situations. And at the same time, I remember during one of the rallies, the rallies were always peaceful, right? It was always when the rallies ended and it got dark that there was violence. For those that don't know, there was, if you want to call it rioting or uprising or whatever, there was violence in the streets of Oakland for a while. People were burning police cars, breaking windows. And I remember one time after one of the rallies, some young black men from East Oakland started breaking windows at a Wells Fargo bank. And so me and a few other people ran up. As they turned, there was another bus station that was in one of those glass bus stations, and they tried to break the window, so we got in between them to try to stop them from breaking the window. And I just remember seeing the anger in the eyes of these young people and just how frustrated they were and how fed up they were with the system and with the violence that they had to witness every single day of their lives. And that night, I was at a friend's house, and we were talking as CAPE about how we were going to respond to the violence, especially with the media, right? We were running press statements, and we had a press conference the following morning. And ultimately, we decided to distance ourselves from the violence. Said, we organized a peaceful protest. Let's focus on that. We had nothing to do with the violence. And I felt a little uneasy about that. And later on, I realized it was because, again, the young people were right to be angry. Were they right to break windows? No, I disagree with those tactical decisions. But they have every right to be angry. And I realized that as a community, we need to create spaces for a lot of these young people, safe spaces for them to be able to release their anger. Because if they don't have safe spaces to release that anger, it's going to get released in the streets. Whether it's during a protest or during gun violence that happens every single day in East Oakland, it's going to get released somewhere. So we need to honor that anger, recognize that they're angry for a good reason, and find ways to help channel that anger. Anger can spark movements. Anger has sparked many movements, but it cannot sustain movements. If anger becomes the driving force behind a movement, we eat ourselves up from inside out. And that's exactly what happened with the Oscar Grant movement. Right? We started arguing with ourselves, and we started accusing each other of working with the police or of not being there for the movement or for the right reasons, and we just destroyed ourselves from inside out. Right? I mean, we destroyed just as many movements as that. We always like to point the finger and say, oh, it's the FBI, it's COINTELPRO, and those are legitimate too. We know that. But we also destroyed just as many of our own movements because we can't learn how to relate with each other within our movements. This is one of the reasons why it's sometimes frustrating for me. Well, let me preface this by saying I personally have a meditation practice. I try to practice meditation as often as I can. The East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland is one of my favorite places in the world. So meditation has been a really important practice for me personally, and at the same time, there's a lot of organizations that come into places like Oakland and go into the schools and teach kids meditation practices and breathing exercises to control their anger. And those types of organizations, like if that's all they do, it's a little frustrating for me. Because we can teach kids to meditate, and that is one piece of the puzzle. And if we're not acknowledging why these kids are angry in the first place, they can meditate every single day of their lives, and if their best friends are getting shot up, if their family members are getting locked up, right? If they're witnessing violence and drugs every single day as soon as they step outside their front doors, meditation is not enough. I was in some of the jails, I talk to a lot of young people, and they say that in our community, if you're 25 years old, you're considered an OG. You're considered an elder in their community at 25 years old. All right? In Oakland a couple of years ago, we had 2 5-year-old kids and a 1-year-old baby shot and killed in drive-bys. I went to a detention school in Selma, Alabama once, ironically called Phoenix. And they had kids from ages 13 to 17 that had been thrown out of other schools. And they just throw these kids, regardless of age, into one room and sit them in front of a computer all day. And so the youngest kid was 13 years old. At 13 years old, society had already given up on this kid. And we wonder why kids are angry. And we tell them to breathe, right? And it's just, we need to be working for peace not just in Afghanistan and not just in Israel and Palestine, but in the streets of East Oakland and in the south side of Chicago and in East St. Louis and in Over the Rhine in Cincinnati and Watts in LA. Because there are wars being waged in our own backyards that sometimes we don't acknowledge. And it sometimes feels safer to work on issues in Afghanistan. And not to say that that's not a huge piece of the puzzle, right? In fact, more people need to be working to end wars overseas. And we need to be more committed to the inequities at home. There was another time I was at a high school in Chicago, and we were doing a week-long training in nonviolence, and there was a young woman who got a text during the middle of our training, text message that her best friend was shot up. And so we obviously put the training on hold for a minute, and we circled up and sang some songs to acknowledge what she was going through. And one of the teachers said, you know, there's neighborhoods even in the city of Chicago where kids are not getting shot up every day. Like what you all experience in your neighborhood, in North Lawndale, is not normal. And there's neighborhoods even in Chicago where this is not normal. And one young woman who was a sophomore at the time stood up and she said, "What?" And she actually started arguing with us. And that's not true. This is how it is everywhere. And I realized that the violence that she witnesses every day of having to bury so many friends by the time she's 15, 16 years old is so normal for her that she couldn't even comprehend that things could be different or that things are different in other neighborhoods because it's all she's known. Now, that young girl is now one of the student peace warriors at North Lawndale College Prep High School. This high school over the last 4 years has seen a 90% reduction in violence, led by the student peace warriors. And that follows a 70% reduction in violence just in the first year after they institutionalized Kingian Nonviolence. In 1 year, 70% reduction. And that to me is evidence of the 6th principle of Kingian Nonviolence. In Kingian Nonviolence we have 6 core principles, the final one being that the universe is on the side of justice. That school, the teachers and the administrators of that school decided to invest in peace and decided to invest in their young people. And those are the returns that they got. And sometimes, you know, people during the trainings, they say, well, how can you tell me that the universe is just when there's so much violence in the world? And I tell them that I've come to see every time a young person gets shot in the streets of Oakland, I see that as evidence of this principle. Because look at all of the investments that we make into violence as a society. Right? We continue to invest in war. We continue to invest in a broken prison system. We continue to invest in broken schools. And then somehow we act shocked when we see violence and injustice in our communities. Maybe if we invested more into peace, then the same justice of the universe will ensure that we'll start to see some of those returns. Right? So fighting for justice in some of the hardest hit communities has to be part of the peace movement. Right? Sometimes the peace movement we think of as the anti-war movement, it's all over there. But the wars overseas are manifestations of the injustices at home. Right? Dr. King said about the Vietnam War that we're sending young black men to fight for rights in Southeast Asia that they don't have in Southeast Georgia. Like, what sense does that make? King was also very critical of a lot of pacifists and a lot of pacifist organizations, because Dr. King believed that oftentimes pacifism, people misunderstand the true meaning of pacifism, that it's just about sitting at home and singing Kumbaya and hoping that the war overseas ends, without looking at what's happening in our own backyards and without having the righteous indignation about what's happening overseas as well as at home. He said that true pacifism isn't about non-resistance to evil, but it's about active nonviolent resistance to evil. Very different things. It's not enough to sit at home and sing Kumbaya. It's not just enough to hope that different people can learn to get along, but we need to be angry. Right? Our message to kids isn't don't be angry, because we need to be angry about the fact that kids are getting shot up. We need to be angry about how much investments we're making into war. We need to be angry about poverty. The question is what we do with that anger. Right? The theme of this conference is harnessing outrage and compassion. So what does it mean to harness anger in a healthy and productive way? The third principle of Kingian Nonviolence says attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil, which I'm sure as a concept is not new to most people in this room. But in the Oscar Grant movement, we attacked the individual. We thought if Johannes Messerli would get locked up, that somehow police shootings would stop. And I always say if it weren't Johannes Messerli, it would have been another police officer. Right? If it weren't Oscar Grant, it would have been some other young black youth. These issues are not specific to any one individual, but we need to learn to build movements that acknowledges and honors our anger and that righteous indignation and targets it at the root causes, at the conditions of why people are so violent, why communities struggle with injustice. Right? That anger is not a bad thing as long as we can channel it in the proper places. And we need to be angry at injustice. Now, I was mentioning that we hated Johannes Messerli, right? And I was talking about how when you hold on to that anger, it just eats you up from inside. And there's an old saying that says, hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? Like when you sit there, when you're just hating somebody and when you're just harboring that anger, the person you're angry at is probably having a wonderful day on their own. It does nothing to affect them, but it kills you inside, which speaks to the fifth principle of Kingian Nonviolence, which is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. That internal violence of that spirit, that emotional violence, like we think of all the homicides as being violent, and they are, but all of those homicides starts in here. Right? In fact, there's twice as many suicides every year in this country as there are homicides. So we have to acknowledge that violence isn't just a physical act, but it's oftentimes what we do to ourselves and what we do to each other without physical acts. Right? All the bullying that happens in schools, all the ways that we treat each other and the way that we misunderstand each other, the way that we oppress minority communities. We're not going in order, but we're talking about the 6 principles if you haven't noticed. The next moment in life that I just took a huge leap in terms of learning was after the Oscar Grant movement. It was the Occupy movement. And in the Occupy movement, I learned a considerable deal about principle number 1, which is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And I learned a lot about that principle from the anarchists. And I had many, many heated debates and disagreement with many anarchist communities. I think we need to acknowledge that there are many anarchist communities that are committed to nonviolence. In fact, to me, the very idea of violence is, it goes against the principles of anarchy for me. Because anarchy by nature is a hierarchical thing, right? Or violence by nature is a hierarchical thing. But even with the diversity of tactics advocates, right, I learned a lot from them about courage, because they are not afraid to put their bodies on the line. They are not afraid to get arrested. They are not afraid to get tear gassed. They are not afraid of confrontations with injustice. Oftentimes, again, that anger, their righteous indignation, is targeted in the wrong places, in my opinion, but they're not afraid to go out there. And it's a criticism that a lot of nonviolent activists oftentimes face, is that we spend too much time talking about compassion and we don't know how to harness our righteous indignation and have the courage to go out and hit the streets. And I think that's something that nonviolent movements can never lose. But it's also, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. right? I learned that a great deal too, because even in nonviolent caucuses in Occupy, there was a lot of violence within the caucus in terms of how we treated each other and how we looked at people within the caucus and outside of the caucuses. Globe used to say that nonviolence isn't just a guide for our external direct actions, but it also has to be a moral guide for our internal interactions within each other, within our own movements. Nonviolence isn't something you clock out of, right? It's like, all right, I'm going to a protest, I'm going to be nonviolent for the next 3 hours, and then I'm going to punch out, and I'm back to myself, right? Nonviolence has to be a way of life. And I also thought a lot about the 99% framing and how brilliant it was in that it brought so many issues and so many communities together. And at the same time, I don't think it's a framing that King would have ultimately supported. You know, King used to say that the issue of segregation wasn't an issue between black people and white people, but it was an issue between justice and injustice. And I was saying during the Occupy movement that this issue isn't an issue between the 99% and the 1%, but it's an issue between 100% of humanity and injustice. It's about what's right and what's wrong. There are plenty of people in the 1% that supported the Occupy movement. There are plenty of people in the 99% that didn't support the Occupy movement, right? It's never as simple as saying these people are right and these people are wrong, but it's about being able to build movements that articulates the root of injustice and being able to target that as the enemy. Principle 4 of nonviolence is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. Gandhi used to say that nonviolence is about making your oppressor see the injustice of their ways through your suffering. So in essence, you're sacrificing your suffering to try to reach the moral conscience of the oppressor or of the general public. And in Occupy, I remember seeing, you remember the image of the students at UC Davis who were sitting there non-violently as they were being pepper sprayed by it was like a fire extinguisher size canister of pepper spray. And I remember how the nation responded to that image. And then I remember how the nation responded to images coming out of Occupy Oakland, where I was active. Very different. When we're able to stay nonviolent in the face of police repression and state repression, it paints a very clear image of who's right and who's wrong. And that public narrative is one of the most important weapons in nonviolence. And when we aren't able to accept that suffering without retaliation, then we lose sight of the goal. And that narrative becomes very confusing for the public. And Dr. Lafayette always says that no revolution is possible without the active support, if not the sympathy, of the majority. Another thing I learned a great deal in Occupy was the importance of negotiation. Occupy Oakland had a policy to not talk to the city of Oakland, which that wasn't sitting well with me. I learned through Kingian Nonviolence that the goal of direct action, again, is to give yourself leverage so you can negotiate and end up in reconciliation. And with all of these encampments, all of these direct actions that was part of the Occupy movement, we were creating so much pressure, right? So much pressure against certain institutions. And then by not negotiating, we were letting all that pressure go to waste. We weren't utilizing the pressure that we were creating. And so direct action is never a goal. That's a huge thing that I learned in Occupy. Now, another place that I've learned an incredible amount is the trainings and the workshops that we do in some of the county jails and the prisons in California. And depending on the institution, the workshops that we do are mandatory. So we start the workshop with some people who are clearly not happy to be there, and they really let us know it. One women's jail that we went to, a young woman came into our class and she's like, I don't have an anger problem. I don't need to be here. This is bull. I'm like, okay. So, good morning. But in that workshop, I didn't know this until the end, but at the very end of the 2 days, there were two women that shared a story with us. And one of them said that the two women in the classroom, they were beefing. They had a long-standing conflict with each other. And so when one of them walked into the room that morning and saw the other one, she was like, oh, I don't know if I can be in this room for the next 2 days with this girl. And she told us that she was so inspired by the first day of our workshop that night she actually went out and reached out to the other woman that she was in a conflict with, and they were able to reconcile. And during the closing circle of the workshop, they shared that story with us, and they embraced in a hug in the middle of the circle. And that was one of the most touching things that I've ever seen during any of our workshops, and that brings us back to the concept of reconciliation and the importance of reconciliation. And how do we build movements that end in reconciliation instead of further divisions and further escalated conflicts? How do we balance that outrage and that righteous indignation with the compassion that leads to the beloved community, in a way that we still have the courage to demand justice, right? That righteous anger, that righteous indignation is what gives us the power to demand justice, and the compassion and the love is what gives us the power to lead to the beloved community. So how do we balance those two things? Anger and love, compassion and outrage can equally be incredibly powerful forces on their own. But if we can combine the two towards the goal of justice, that's a powerful movement. It's an incredibly powerful movement. Dr. King used to say that power without love is reckless and abusive. That love without power is sentimental and anemic. That power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So that's our charge, right? That's our challenge, is to build a movement that has the power that comes with that righteous indignation, the courage that comes with the righteous indignation, with the compassion of agapic love. Those are two difficult things to balance. It's things that King was incredible in being able to kind of touch both extremes at once. But that's our challenge. And I believe that if we can harness both, that outrage, the moral outrage, and the love and the compassion, with a deep commitment to the idea of shugyo, with a deep commitment to training, and the courage to demand justice, that we can build a truly powerful movement of nonviolent peace warriors that leads to the beloved community. So I want to end my comments here. Thank you very much for having me. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A, but thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. Thank you.